Thanks for having me. Good morning from Boston. I guess good afternoon to you all. So today I'm going to talk about the the sort of the underlying physical activity effects on brain and cognition. This is not a sports specific talk, but certainly, as you can imagine, physical activity and physical activity behaviors are the sort of underlying strengths of competing in sport. Um, and so I think it's important to point out that most kids are not athletes. In fact, the majority of children are becoming increasingly sedentary in this generation. Um, and if you look at the number of people who or a number of teenagers across the world, 13, 15 years old, who aren't achieving recommendations, you can see that there's quite a few boys and girls. Girls are a little worse off than boys that aren't achieving the recommended 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity each day. With this comes an increased prevalence of being overweight and unfit. And unfortunately, when you look at the US, you can see from 1985 to 2010, that we've grown larger as a people, as a nation. And when we take snapshots of just school-age children in 2003, 2007, and 2011, you can see that that more and more children are also becoming obese in the United States. Now, one of the issues is that sedentary childhood often leads to sedentary adulthood. We just heard Dr. McNamara talk about youth sport and its relationship to adult sport. But what we do know, what might be a little different here, is that what we do know is that kids who are physically active in the youth are more likely to be physically active as adults because they certainly have the efficacy to know how to be physically active. And so when we look again at the United States, you can see that that there's a strong percentage of the population, up to a third, that performs no leisure time physical activity. And this is particularly true in the South, in the areas of the South. COVID didn't help us. These are data from my laboratory where we can see the drop off in children whose VO2 max, that is their aerobic capacity. It's a gold standard measure of aerobic fitness. We can see it dropped from the year prior to the COVID shut-in in Boston, to just after the shut-in ended. And that's a precipitous drop, as much as 50% in terms of percentage drop in VO2. And when we look at the days since the COVID shutdown, we see a nice linear effect such that increased days of shutdown led to decreased VO2. And so it's just an interesting relationship that we were able to observe. Now, recent estimates have indicated that this generation of children will live less healthy and have shorter lives, which in the United States, this is the first time this pattern has occurred in a population or in a cohort. To make matters worse, school districts are eliminating daily physical activity opportunities from the school day, meaning recess, kids don't walk to school or ride their bikes to school anymore. PE is on the decline. And this is to make time for formal academic education. But what we know, and not to give you the punchline too early, but time spent being physically active doesn't detract from academic performance. And in fact, there's two views of that. The first is that there's no relationship, which is certainly a win for physical activity, because it means you have a more physically active child at no cost to academic performance. And the second is that there's actually a nice relationship such that data from my lab support the idea that increased aerobic fitness is related to academic performance in math and reading. This is the Illinois Standardized Achievement Test in math and reading. It goes from 200 to 400. And you can see that with an increased laps run in a field test of aerobic fitness, we see a relationship with increased performance on these tasks. When we looked at muscle strength and muscle flexibility in these pre-adolescent children, we didn't see any relationship. These are approximately 8 to 10-year-old kids. And when we look at body mass index, we can see that an increase in body mass index is related to a decrease in these academic outcomes. And so for the next 20 years of my career, I spent most of my time studying these two aspects of health, that is aerobic fitness and body mass. Now, I'm going to slowly switch us over to talking about the brain. But I just wanted to begin by talking a bit about experience and plasticity. This is something that Dr. McNamara did a really nice job of in the beginning. I won't do as nice a job. I'm just going to give a quick overview. Um, that that the brain responds to experience, and this is what we oftentimes term plasticity. And so we can think about this in terms of the genetic backdrop as well as we can think about in terms of experience. And you have experience expected influences, and these are experiences that are expected by a species. So, for instance, we expect to have variations in light and gradients of light to help our visual system develop. If we're reared in the dark, there's experiments with cats that show when they're reared in the dark that their visual system doesn't develop as well. And fortunately, when they turn the lights on, the cats regain their visual acuity. Experience dependent are the idiosyncratic aspects of our lives. That is, that these are processes that or experiences that shape our adaptations. And so you might think about, for instance, starting a child very early in ice hockey. They would learn to skate at a very early age, and this would relate to motor adaptations, neural adaptations, and behavioral adaptations that might benefit them later in life. For instance, walking on an icy street in Boston in the winter can be very treacherous, and maybe those adaptations, that plasticity that occurred, might help them navigate their balance on these streets. And there's all kinds of examples in sport. For instance, and outside of sport, I should say, we know there's great examples of vocations. So there's the famous London taxi driver story showing differences in structure and function of the hippocampus, which is involved in spatial memory. Um, we know that music, as Brooke talked about, there's other work that shows that auditory acuity is stronger in conductors than it is in the orchestra. Um, Sport, there's various examples there. My advisor, Brad Hatfield, showed that elite marksmen had different patterns of brain activity, brain function than non-elite, and so forth. And so with that, I want to talk a little bit about physical activity and physical fitness and look at its effects on brain and cognition. So if we start with brain structure, when we look at, these are cross-sectional data looking at children as a function of their fitness. And what we find is that certain tissues in the brain, like the superior frontal cortex and superior temporal cortex, as well as lateral occipital, showed this relationship with fitness, such that there was decreased brain thickness in these kids, which is interesting because we know that kids have they generate an abundance of brain tissue, and then through the use it or lose it principles, they thin out in certain regions compared to others. And this is what an adult brain looks like, with thinning of certain tissue. And what's interesting here is that we saw with increased aerobic fitness, we saw increased thinning in these three areas. And only in the superior frontal cortex was thinning related to math achievement, suggesting that these same regions that are involved, that are influenced by fitness, are also involved in academic performance. Now, when we use randomized control trials, these are data from my second Fit Kids study, Fitness Improves Thinking in Kids. We find that there's selective effects again of white matter integrity. And that is, when we look here at a section of the corpus callosum, the main white matter, or the main tract between the two hemispheres, what we see is that at pretest, there's no difference. Kids who are admitted to a 9-month after-school physical activity program in which they perform 60 minutes or more of moderate to vigorous physical activity, we see an increase, if I find my cursor again, we see an increase in white matter in that tract. And kids who are on the wait list for 9 months, we see no change. It looks like it dips slightly, but it's really no statistical difference. While these are statistically different. And we see this effect across certain aspects or certain networks, as you can see up here. We see it most in the corpus callosum. We also see it in the corona radiata, but we don't necessarily see it in all regions, as you can see here, not statistically so, suggesting that there's selective effects of fitness or engaging in a physical activity curriculum on white matter integrity. Now, other tasks of ours, or other experiments of ours, use tasks and relate them to relate them to specific structures. And so these are some earlier data. Again, these are cross-sectional, looking at the difference between higher and lower fit kids. And what we find is that the hippocampus is particularly susceptible to aerobic fitness. These data are well supported by the animal literature, mostly in rodents. And what we find is that higher fit kids have greater hippocampal volume. That is, they have more structure of that hippocampus. This is important because the hippocampus is involved in aspects of memory, as you can see here. And when we look at higher and lower fit children, and we look at tasks that are independent of the hippocampus, that is, this is just an item memory task that doesn't require the hippocampus to perform it, it's an easier task and it shows no difference in performance. But when we bring that hippocampus online and we look at a hippocampal dependent task where they have to make relationships between items and remember them later on, we find that higher fit kids outperform lower fit kids. And statistically, when we look at that relationship between fitness and relational memory, what we see is that hippocampal volume is a moderating factor, such that increased volume relates to increased performance on that task. Now, we spent a lot more time studying brain function, and brain function is certainly can be looked at a number of different ways. We can look at it from using EEG to MRI to fMRI and so forth. But I think before we jump into that, let me just give a quick overview of executive function or executive control. This is an aspect of cognition that is involved in the selection, scheduling, and coordination of complex cognitive processes. What we're talking about here are the difficult aspects that require a good amount of cognition that's intentional and goal-driven. And oftentimes we think about executive functions in three areas: inhibition, our ability to ignore distraction and stay focused, our ability to hold items in our mind and later use them or recall them. This is working memory. And cognitive flexibility, which is oftentimes called multitasking, is our ability to pay attention to one stimulus, inhibit another, and then switch. And so this is what we do, for instance, as you can see here, when a kid is on their phone while a math lesson or some lesson's going on. We all think we're very good at multitasking. We're actually not. This is why things like driving and texting are illegal. But we use executive functions throughout our everyday life. It's important for our mental health and our physical health, as I'm talking about today. It's important for school readiness and success, for vocational or job success. And if none of those sell you, then executive function is also important for marital harmony, which is important. And so with that, I just want to give a brief overview of two systematic reviews. One had a meta-analysis involved where they looked at sport and executive functions. The first is all participants, so these are kids and adults, and Brimwell and colleagues found or examined the relationship of sport performance with executive functions, including inhibition, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. And then separately, they also looked at visual attention. And they included 22 experiments in their systematic review and found that there were issues with how sport expertise was classified across the studies. So there's lots of heterogeneity. But more than not, they found that accuracy or response accuracy was more commonly reported than reaction time. So they're more interested in how well they performed over how quickly they performed. And they concluded that despite a limited database, there was a positive relationship between executive functioning and sport performance. But they were quick to say that there was no strong conclusions made regarding the direct role of executive functioning in sport performance. That is, there's a relationship, but it wasn't causal. The second study was a systematic review and a meta-analysis, and they only examined children who performed sport and examined their executive functions, and they only included 8 studies with 424 kids who were school age, 6 to 18 years old. And they found that first they categorized executive function again into inhibition, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. And they found a rather large effect size that was observed for all categories of executive functioning. And they concluded that healthy children should be encouraged to practice sport performance to enhance executive functions. Sorry, I forgot to go ahead and click that. And so what I would argue is that that's a fairly safe conclusion, and it doesn't differ much from the work we do outside of sport performance, and that is that children should be encouraged to perform physical activity or sport in this case in order to engender benefits to brain and in this case executive functioning. Now, so other work from my laboratory examined this more directly, and that is that we conducted an after-school physical activity program I talked a little bit about. Here's a bit more detail, in which children came to our athletic center on 150 out of 170 school days in a 9-month school year. That is that they came to the intervention every day that school met for a full session. And that was compared with a waitlist control group of children who did the pretest in the summer going in, were not contacted all year, and then did the post-test at the end, and they were given access to the intervention a year later, unstudied. We had a total of 221 children, fairly equally split between the two. And each day that they came into the lab, or sorry, into the intervention, they performed 70 minutes or more of moderate to vigorous physical activity in an intermittent fashion. So they were achieving guidelines that the US had set forth. There was efficacy in this intervention, as you can see at the bottom. It's probably easier to see, where there's just shy of a 6% change in aerobic fitness, that is VO2 max, over the course of the 9 months in the intervention group, while those in the waitlist control group increased by less than half a percentile, which is likely a function of typical development. When we looked at event-related brain potentials, this is an EEG that we use that was tethered to a stimulus, and so we're looking at time-locked clips of the neuroelectric signal. And on the right is our wait list. You can see very little change over the course of 9 months. These are change maps. And on the left, you can see quite a bit of change. We were interested in the P3 potential. This potential reflects the allocation of attentional resources in the service of working memory. And so what we're looking at here is an individual's ability to attend to a stimulus environment, update their working memory, and perform accordingly. And when we look at just the most executive function demanding tasks, so this is an inhibition task with an upregulation of executive functioning required, we see an increase in that P3 component at post-test compared to pre-test. And same with a multitask or a switch task that requires us to be flexible, to allocate flexibly our cognition. And again, we see this upregulation of P3 at post-test compared to pre-test. So in both cases, what we found was that following a 9-month intervention, kids who engaged in that physical activity intervention demonstrated an increase in the allocation of attentional resources at the neural level compared to pretest and compared to the waitlist control group. Now, when we look at their behaviors, what we see is that there's an increase in performance on both that inhibition task and the cognitive flexibility task, as you can see here, showing that they had a greater change from pre to post compared to those in the waitlist control group. And we see a bit of a dose-response relationship. I'm going to say that very cautiously, in that when we looked at attendance rate, we found that that's what you see at the bottom of the scatter plots, those who with greater attendance show an increased change in that neuroelectric P3 potential and an increased change in response accuracy, suggesting that they had to be there and engage in the physical activity curriculum in order to derive the benefits of that program. Now, other work from this project used fMRI, and I won't go into too many details here, but essentially what you're looking at is back when we did this work, we were looking at the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, areas of the prefrontal cortex that are involved in executive functioning. Here's our waitlist control group, no change across performance, as you can see here. When we look at the intervention group, you can see a nice change from where there's a reduction in activation over time, over that 9 months. And these are young, healthy adults. And so you can see that at post-test, kids in the intervention have a more adult-like activation of this tissue when performing this executive function task. So much so they don't differ from young adults, and they do differ statistically from those in the waitlist control group. And so when we look at response accuracy, we see a similar pattern such that there's an increase in activation from pre to post in the intervention group. It's less so in the control group. And here are young adults again. And what we find at post-test is that the physical activity intervention kids at post-test are no different from the young adults, but they're also no different from the control group, where the control group is different from young adults. So what this suggests is that changes in the brain may occur before changes in behavior. And we see that these changes, in both cases, suggest that more physically active kids are more demonstrating a more adult-like profile in terms of brain and behavior. Now, where we are today, and I'm just going to show this one slide, is that we're less interested in single swaths of tissue. That is, we're not just interested in particular regions. Rather, we're interested in networks of connectivity and networks of brain function. And there's a lot of ways to divvy up the brain and look at it. And so in this case, we're using an accepted model of the 7 networks, where we're looking at nodes in each network and seeing whether they're firing together or firing opposite one another. And what we find on the right are all the cognitive networks. So here's our default mode network, which is involved in aspects of memory. These are our 2 attention networks. And at the bottom is our executive function network, what's called the frontal parietal attention network or executive function network. And what we find is that higher fit individuals demonstrate greater activation within these cognitive networks. But when we look at somatosensory or limbic networks and even visual, we don't see that same relationship with fitness. We see that that these networks exist and they're active while performing tasks, but they're not related to fitness, where the cognitive networks are, suggesting some selectivity of brain function, not just over global overall changes to brain. Now, importantly, I think that knowing that people are sedentary and knowing that the vast majority of school-age kids aren't interested in being physically active, some questions have arisen about whether or not there's a role for physical activity in the school day that provides immediate benefits rather than enduring benefits. And I think there's great utility in this when school districts in the US are, and in other countries as well, I know, are not engaging in regular physical activity. And so the question is, if they engage in acute doses, oftentimes here now called exercise snacks, do we get any sort of immediate benefit from it? And so here we have 20 children. Again, we're still looking at this P3 potential, that is the allocation of attention in the service of working memory. And what we're looking at, kids who engaged in a dose of exercise, in this case, it's 20 minutes of moderate walking on a treadmill. So in these early experiments, we had kids walk at a moderate pace, 60% of their max capacity. No kid was unable to do this task. It's a very easy form of exercise. And we had them come in, and one day they performed the dose of exercise. On the other day, they performed 20 minutes of seated rest. So this is what you might get in a classroom, for instance. And we looked at the changes in brain activity. And what we see here at the top is 20 minutes of seated rest. At the bottom is 20 minutes of walking. Following that dose of walking, we get an upregulation of that P3 potential again. And it was generalized across both conditions, but selective to the condition that required greater amounts of executive functioning. So when they're required to inhibit more, the dose of exercise helped upregulate that P3 potential. They're allocating more attentional resources. We've replicated this study a few times. We've replicated in kids with ADHD. Here they are after 20 minutes of reading and after 20 minutes of exercise. You can see the upregulation of that P3 potential. And we've done this in children who are all typical healthy kids that are high performers and low performers. And what I mean by that is that not everyone has the same executive functioning capability. Some are better executive functioners than others. And so when we took baseline executive functioning and divided the group into those so there are 20 kids who are very good executive functioners, good at inhibition, and others who are not, 20 who are not. We found that at rest, we saw this difference, right? Those are higher functioners, had higher P3 amplitude. They were allocating more attentional resources. But after that 20-minute dose of exercise, what we found was that there was no difference, suggesting that the dose of exercise benefited those who needed it most. Now, when we look at their performance on this task, you can see that whether we're talking about kids with ADHD or these are typically developing kids, we see that following the dose of exercise, they perform better in both cases compared to after seated rest. So they have a higher accuracy in their responding. And we look at their academic performance following that dose of exercise. We use a standardized achievement test of math, spelling, and reading. What we see is that reading and arithmetic performance is better after the dose of exercise compared to after the dose of seated rest. And so this suggests a single doses of exercise provides some utility in terms of increasing brain function selectively. It has a relationship with how they perform on inhibition tasks and how they perform on classroom-based tasks of reading and arithmetic. And we know that this effect at this dose lasts for approximately 1 hour. Now, knowing that getting treadmills in the classroom and having kids exercise for 20 minutes is difficult. And so we looked at high intensity interval training. And this is important because this is short bouts of exercise at a higher dose. And this is akin to how a lot of kids perform sport, right? If you think about ice hockey, it's an all-out sprint for 30 seconds or 45 seconds, and then there's several minutes of rest. And so when we compared high-intensity interval training here, 8 minutes of it, with that dose of walking on a treadmill, in this case, is 65%, and with seated rest, this is heart rate that you're looking at, percent of max. And so it's you get up to about 95% in HIIT. You stay at about 65% for continuous walking on the treadmill and 40% at rest. We find, importantly, in the middle here, we find the upregulation of that P3 component after continuous aerobic exercise on a treadmill, compared to here, rest is at the top. This is continuous aerobic exercise, and this is HIIT. And so we find that there's an upregulation of the P3 potential again compared to rest. But what's interesting is that HIIT shows a downregulation. We see decreased P3 activity, decreased allocation of resources. But yet, when we look at behavior, what we find is that HIIT perform best in terms following HIIT compared to the continuous aerobic exercise and rest. Now, when we look at reaction time, we can see that both HIIT and continuous aerobic exercise perform better than seated rest. So I'll be honest, we don't know. We don't know why we see upregulation in one case and downregulation in the other. But we do see that regardless of the form of exercise, we find that there's an improvement in cognition in the period following that dose of exercise compared to seated rest. Now, what we've begun to show is that these doses of exercise or exercise programming isn't synonymous for all individuals. That is, not everyone gets the same benefit. And so interestingly, to stick with this acute exercise piece, we find overall our effect, again, regardless of body mass. That is, here kids after exercise compared to after rest, this acute effect is nice when they're challenged with tasks that require more inhibition. But then when we break it down by body mass, and you can see it more clearly probably at the bottom, is that with increases in BMI, we see decreases in performance after the dose of exercise compared to after rest. It's actually there in both conditions, but it's stronger in the incongruent condition, suggesting that single dose of exercise, in this case, is 60% of max capacity, is not beneficial to children with higher BMI, higher body mass index, where we do see that effect for kids at lower BMI, as you can see out here. Now, interestingly, when we look at rest, what we find is that children with obesity, and these are children in this case with the highest amount of obesity. So this is class 3 obesity. They're in the 99th percentile or above of their peers. And we give them a task, a simple stimulus discrimination task. So in this case, it's lions and tigers. And the task is to look at the tigers and press a button whenever they see the lion. And we build up a prepotent response. And then what we do is we force them to inhibit that. We take it away. we have them respond every time to the tiger and inhibit that response to the lion, which is actually quite difficult. And when we look at healthy weight and children with obesity, what we see is that in the go condition, the easier condition, there's no relationship. But in the no-go condition where they're forced to inhibit, there's a drop off in kids with obesity compared to healthy weight children. When we look at brain activation, what we see is that these are differences between the two conditions. We see that children with obesity aren't able to upregulate as many resources in this inhibition task, where kids with healthy weight are able to do so in a grand fashion. That is, are really able to selectively upregulate brain resources when necessary, where children with obesity are not showing that difference between the two conditions of easy and difficult, because they're allocating more attentional resources regardless of condition, so they don't have anything extra to throw in there when the task is upregulated and becomes harder. And so when we look at the relationship between adiposity and cognition and achievement, we're now getting away from just using measures of body mass index, and instead we're using specific measures from a dual X-ray absorbometry, a DEXA scan, and we're actually calculating the amount of fat mass in their abdominal. So this is our belly fat, which in children and in adults is a measure of health, and it's a measure of various diseases. And what we see here is that with an increase in fat mass, we see poorer performance, a greater cost to inhibition, and a greater cost to working memory. And these are all school 8 through 10-year-old children. And then we look at standardized achievement tests, we see that there's a reduction in reading, a reduction in spelling, and a reduction in arithmetic. That is, with increases in fat mass, we see decreased performance on these different aspects of academic achievement. And so what I'm showing here is that with an increase in body mass or specific calculations of fat mass, we're actually seeing that kids with obesity perform more poorly on these executive function tasks. They perform more poorly on tasks of academic performance, and that single doses of exercise do not provide the same benefits that they see that their healthy weight peers enjoy. Now with that, I'm going to spend just this last section here talking about one real world application, and it's in quotes because it's a virtual real world application. One of the things my lab likes to do is to see if we can get outside the laboratory, and again in quotes, outside the laboratory. And that what I mean by that is not use laboratory-based assessments or brain function or structure, and instead see, like, can we try and create environments where children are engaged in a way they normally would be. And so I'm going to show you a video of the classroom. I'll warn you, this virtual classroom, I'll warn you that it's a little bit, that the sound is a little bit weird just in the way we created it. But before I do, I just want to point out, this is an acute experiment. So in one condition, children, they walked on a treadmill for 20 minutes to 60% of their max capacity, and the other, they sat quietly for 20 minutes. They then got the lesson, and then we looked at their performance on that lesson. And so let's see if I can get this going here.
All right, class, settle down. We're going to watch a video that goes along with today's lesson. Pay attention, there will be a quiz on the video.
I know, how cool would it be to be Pharaoh? Dear Tim and Moby, I'm trying to find out information on the pharaohs in Egypt. Can you help me? From Justine. Sure, the pharaohs were the kings and queens of ancient Egypt. The term pharaoh actually comes from...
All right.
So as you can see, the kids in the virtual environment, they're able to look around, see other students in the class. We distract the children throughout. I don't have a great clip of that, where there might be an announcement coming over the speakers. They can hear a car honking. A kid will turn around, ask for a pencil, and so they're in a busy classroom environment with some distractions. They're paying attention to a lesson, and then we give them a quiz based on that lesson. This is all from a company called Brain Pop. They developed these quizzes, and and they're typically 10 to 20 questions. And what we found, first of all, is just to show that heart rate was continuous and stable during exercise compared to at rest. It was somewhere between, it was about 63% increase during exercise compared to rest. And what we found was that after exercise, these children performed better on the quiz compared to after they rested. And we had a number of different quizzes that we used, and we counterbalanced it all. So they're getting, so children were getting similar quizzes across both conditions. But what we didn't expect was that we found, again, that kids with higher IQs didn't show much difference. That is, that following exercise or following rest, there was no statistical difference in children with high IQ, but kids with a lower IQ showed that difference. So much like before, we found that those kids who are lower executive functioners, they're the ones who responded better to the dose of exercise. The same thing was found here. And that is that they perform better after, better after exercise compared to after rest, where kids in the high group did not. And so, again, I think we're finding differences, whether it's in the laboratory or in the virtual classroom, but that these differences are influenced by secondary factors such as baseline cognitive ability or baseline or their IQ, not necessarily based on just their IQ. And so with that, I just want to give some conclusions, and I can turn it over for questions at that point. So the first is that over the last several decades, we've had new insights into physical activity and fitness effects on brain structure and function. We see these effects in kids. This field began a good deal later than that of adults or older adults, and so it's catching up now. And what we've seen is that fitness is linked to changes in cognition, and that these changes are disproportionately larger for tasks or task components that are underpinned by specific neural networks, particularly the neural networks involved in executive functioning, memory that's involved in hippocampus or hippocampal dependent memory. Single doses of exercise provide temporary benefits to brain and cognition, but that this isn't true for everyone. And that is that adiposity or body mass index may serve as a marker for decreased cognitive performance. And that adiposity may dampen exercise-induced cognitive gains. And I'm going to say that very cautiously, because we can't do the experiments in humans that we want to do. That is, we could test this using interventions where we take children with obesity and lean them out and look at how changes in their body mass influence cognition, but we can never do the other manipulation. That is, we can't take lean kids and add body mass to them. We can't have them gain weight and have them become obese, because that's not ethical. And so at this point, this remains, I would say, a relationship and not a causal one. But I guess I'll conclude today by saying that early school-based interventions to promote health behaviors is crucial for lifespan health and effective functioning of the brain, cognition, and in the case of children, academic performance. So with that, I just want to acknowledge my network of people from all around the world and ask if you have any questions. Thank you.